why we are being miseducated and how we are being miseducated. This was a piece in the New York Times, the 18th of February, 1993. Teaching in a closet or a shower. Crowded classes and more students are a portent of the future. It is so crowded in some New York City public schools that some students get lunch at 10:30 a.m. Some attend classes in churches, empty warehouses, factories, even defunct department stores. Classes are taught in closets, and computer labs are converted shower stalls. And the problem is only getting worse. And they talk about the largest surge in enrollment in a quarter of a century in New York City schools. To indicate here that city public school enrollment peaked in 1971 with the record of 1,140,349 students, as the city entered a period of stark decline and retrenchment. What are we saying here? The number of students that are entering New York City schools is increasing at the very point when New York City schools are becoming poverty-stricken, when the New York City school budgets are what? Decreasing and shrinking.
In his powerful lecture, The Failure of the Education System, Dr. Amos N. Wilson critiques the systematic miseducation of Black children in America and exposes the deeper motivations behind educational inequality. Wilson argues that the American educational system does not fail Black children by accident. It is intentionally structured to preserve white dominance and limit the development of Black potential. Rather than equipping Black students with knowledge and skills to empower themselves and their communities, the system offers them a curriculum devoid of relevance of their history, culture, and real-world needs. Wilson emphasizes that education in this country is less about learning and more about social conditioning, training Black children to accept their place at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy. Wilson points out that many Black children attend severely underfunded and neglected schools, often staffed by underqualified teachers who are ill-equipped to nurture their students' intellectual growth. These substandard living environments lack essential resources like updated textbooks, functioning technology, and stimulating extracurricular programs. The growth in enrollment among Black children far exceeds the education system's willingness to fund adequate facilities, materials, or qualified personnel. As a result, rather than being educated to succeed, Black students are being warehoused and pushed through a system that expects little from them and prepares them for even less.
This is the school system that African American people have inherited. A school system that is becoming constricted and restricted in its financial possibilities. And yet at the very point that it is becoming constricted in its ability to finance our education, the number of students entering the system is increasing. Schools officials use the opportunity to close and dispose of outdated school buildings that they thought they would never need again. In other words, in the 70s, they thought that the decline in the population of New York City schools would continue. And so they closed the schools, they got rid of them because they thought they would never need them again. And now, lo and behold, what has happened? The population has increased and we have tremendous overcrowding. Much of the recent increase has been attributed to new immigrants who have been filling up public schools in some neighborhoods while seats in other neighborhoods go begging. Some of the growth is also because of the economic pressures on parents during a recession that has resulted in sagging enrollments in private and parochial schools. We are seeing a shrinkage in the population of parochial schools, that is Catholic schools and other private schools. While enrollment in our schools continues to grow dramatically, our share of the state's allocation for education continues to shrink. This was stated by Mr. Fernandez, the outgoing chancellor. In the last 3 years, more than 125,000 immigrant children enrolled in city schools. The largest group came from the Dominican Republic, followed by Jamaica, the former Soviet Union. We're going to come back to this immigrant issue, by the way. The former Soviet Union. In other words, as the Soviet Empire broke down, A lot of the people are leaving that empire, including Soviet Jews and other European white folk, and coming to America. And of course, are being enrolled in New York City schools. They're also coming from Guyana, China, and Haiti. They note that between 1971 and 1991, enrollment in private or parochial schools fell by more than a third to 267,838 from 415,939. So the educational situation here is going to be one of great struggle between groups for shrinking resources. The struggle has been taking place since the very beginning between white and black, with the whites, of course, manipulating the budgets and manipulating the nature of education of African people to maintain their power relations and their dominance over African people. A relationship that they do not intend to give up. Let's compare some of the spending per student in the New York City area between 1986 and 1987. Manhasset, which is out on Long Island, the spending per student per year amounts to $11,372. That is between 86 and 87. Now look at how that compares with New York City during that period, which spent $5,585. In other words, on Long Island, in places where white students are, the state spends more than twice as much money per student than in New York City. This is how ethnic groups, this is how class groups maintain their advantage and maintain their power. Let's look again. Jericho, Long Island. Again, $11,325 per student. Great Neck, $11,000. Again, compare that now to the $5,000 figure I mentioned in New York City. Bronxville, $10,000. Yonkers, Rye, New York, $9,000. Yonkers, $7,000 per student. Levittown, $6,000. Mount Vernon, $6,000. Roosevelt, $6,000. Down to New York City, $5,000. It's no accident then that people coming from these areas, going to these schools, have an advantage over people coming out of the New York City schools. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're not aware of these facts, if you're not struggling in terms of the state allocations for educational funds, if you're not aware of how money is allocated in the state for education, then you're going to be victimized by those allocations. And as you can see, the allocations are weighted to maintaining the status quo. Let's look then again at how this gap has widened. Let's bring it more up to date. In terms of 1989 and 90, Manhasset, $15,000 per student. On Long Island again, Jericho, $14,000. Great Neck, $15,000. Now we're coming closer to home. Mount Vernon, $9,000. Roosevelt, $8,000. New York City, $7,000. So what are we indicating here then? That the ethnic and class struggle continues, and that ethnic and class struggle is such that those ethnic groups and those classes which can exercise political and economic power will bias the distribution of educational funds in such a way that their political and economic power is maintained. Now, those are the basic average figures. Now, you can go into particular areas such as Amagansett, Long Island, and you will recognize that there, the average amount of money spent per student in that area is something like $45,000 per student. Yes, you have these tremendous differences. And so you have students who are sitting in computer labs where a class is no more than about 20 people. And they got more than enough computers per student, where just the computer course itself, the catalog dealing with computer education amounts to 55 pages alone, just dealing with the computer education courses that they offer in their schools. So what do you got going on here? Ethnic groups, class groups using their power to maintain their power and to maintain their differences. So they'll let up on you a little bit. They'll give you a little head start and a little this, but in the end, there's no intention to give you any head start. There's no intention to even let you start out the race even at all. The question then becomes, if the nation no longer needs African people, will it continue to educate them? You see, the thing that we fail to ask ourselves, as indicated by Brother Patrick there, is what is the function of education? We think as African people that the major function of education is to prepare people for jobs. But you never ask yourself, what if the jobs do not exist? We assume that there is a job out there for every educated person, so that all we need to do is just get educated and reach out for the jobs and they'll just fall in our hands. But this is another myth. This is not the reality, ladies and gentlemen, of this country today. And it's seldom the reality of many nations. There are many nations and there are countries today where the supply of educated people far exceeds the number of jobs available for those people. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why we have a large number of immigrants in this country today is because there is little opportunity for educated immigrants in their own country. The average immigrant coming into this country today, in other words, I believe if my figures are not wrong, but they're in the ballpark, my last reading was that 46% of the immigrants coming into the United States today have college degrees. This compares with something like 18% of native-born blacks with college degrees. Understand? Even if you compare people coming from the Caribbean, I believe it is something like 30% Caribbean with college level education, as against something like 18 to 16% of native-born African American with college level education. And when you look at black males, you're comparing something like 30% of Caribbean educated people as against something like 13% African American males. So there's a major question that is buried in these statistics. And that situation is this: why should we educate African Americans when we can ship in educated people from other nations and other places? And I'm going to come back to that in a minute, because this is exactly what is going on and what is happening. But the more fundamental question is, if there are few jobs, or if there is a slow growth of jobs, do we need to continue to produce the same number or a larger number of educated people? If, as we argued earlier, education like welfare is used to regulate people and to regulate the country, then why, if whites did recognize that the number of jobs that are available do not exceed the number of educated people, why then would not the system decide that it's going to do what? Cut back on the number of educated people, even though it will hide that behind a lot of mystical ideas that they're dropping out on their own, that they don't have ambition, that, they come from the wrong class background, or they come from the projects and all that other stuff. But in the end, no matter how they explain it, there will be fewer of us getting education, and therefore fewer of us to compete with the others. Even if this country needed the African American, could it educate him according to standard methods? You see, that is, we are beginning to run into the situation where the country could say, yes, we could possibly and I'm speaking hypothetically because this is not the reality. You could say hypothetically that yes, we may need more African Americans in the labor market and we should bring more of them in. A major question becomes then, can these schools really appropriately educate African people, particularly when these schools are based on another model?